All right, in this video, I just want to do a brief introduction to Bloom's taxonomy, which is something you may or may not be familiar with already as a student. So Bloom's taxonomy is really a framework that describes levels of kind of knowledge mastery, is how it was first described. So it was kind of developed by Benjamin Bloom and some of his colleagues back in the 1950s. So this has been a concept that's been around for quite a while. And it's kind of a hierarchical categories that progress all the way from remembering, which is just basically your ability to regurgitate facts and figures and definitions and things like that, all the way up to creating, which would be something like coming up with new ideas, coming up with new theories, coming up with new processes for solving problems, things like that. So it's kind of this, again, hierarchical categories that are kind of the lowest level, which would be remembering, all the way up to kind of pushing the boundaries of what is known and what's possible through creating, and everywhere in between, right? So Bloom's taxonomy is really well known by educators because a lot of times they'll use it to kind of figure out when they're writing learning objectives for their class, like what am I expecting students to know when they complete this class? Now for introductory classes, it may be things like remembering, understanding, some of the lower level outcomes. For higher level classes, you may be expected to move beyond applying, analyzing, some of the higher level things. So educators know this well, right? Because they use it as kind of a way to target in what level they expect their students to be at by the end of the course. Same thing, educators kind of look at it too when they're writing exam questions. I'll say, what do I expect students to be able to do, right? And then they'll say, well, this question is more about application. Maybe this one's just about understanding, analyzing, whatever it may be. So this is, again, a framework that's utilized and well understood by educators, but I found that students often don't really, aren't necessarily always familiar with it. And I think sometimes that's a missed opportunity. So when we look at the different levels of Bloom's taxonomy, the lowest level is going to be remembering, right? That's the bottom of the hierarchy, the bottom of the pyramid. And this is most basic, right? It's just being able to kind of recognize or even just recall information from memory. So this is, hey, you maybe went through a lecture and you could kind of parrot back the definition, or you memorized a few different facts or statistics or something like that. You really don't understand them, but you are able to kind of at least parrot them back a little bit, just kind of regurgitate information. That's really remembering. So I think we'd all look at that and say that's not really a meaningful level of learning, right? Just being able to parrot back information. Then we move up to understanding. Understanding is the next level, and that's really where we can take concepts and information and kind of describe it in our own words, right? We have enough of an understanding of it where we don't just have to parrot back the information in the instructor's words or what we've read. We're able to kind of say, okay, this is how I think of this concept. This is how I conceptualize this information. So that's kind of the second level of understanding, right? Now, this is a point that I think students kind of get thrown off a little bit by, because I think sometimes they think just because they can explain something means they really understand it at a high level. But we look at Bloom's, understanding is not that high of a level, right? We can move up to actually being able to apply it, analyze it, elevate it, and actually create, right? So understanding is just the starting point, right? Just being able to explain something in your own words is certainly not an extraordinarily high level of knowledge mastery, right? The next level is applying, right? This is where we can use information in new situations to solve problems, right? So this would be kind of, you've learned something in class, now all of a sudden you're maybe working with a patient. Can you take that information and can you apply it? Can you use it, right? Now, we know there's a mismatch here. Sometimes we can explain something, but we don't necessarily aren't able to understand how it could be applicable, or we may understand something in a rudimentary level where we say, when we actually start working with patients, we're like, I don't actually know how to transition what I know into something that actually I can put into action. So that's kind of that next step, is being able to apply the information you're learning in your classes. The second level, or the next level, is analyzing. So this is really where we can do kind of in-depth examinations. We can break down larger concepts into its different components. We can say, how does different pieces of information relate to each other? So this is where we start to see the bigger picture, right? We're not just viewing isolated pieces of information anymore. We're starting to make some stronger connections. So again, this is a higher level. Evaluating is where we can start to make some judgments, right? So it may be we learn about two approaches and we can evaluate what would be the better approach for a given scenario. right? In order for us to do that, we really need to understand the basis for both of the approach. We need to understand the pros and cons. We need to be able to think about this scenario and which one it fits better with. So again, evaluating, which is kind of making a judgment or a choice, tends to be a higher level. This would be, as a healthcare provider, maybe you're seeing a patient with a certain condition and you have to make a choice, if you're a physician or something, between prescribing 2 different types of medications. You have to really understand the mechanism both. You have to understand the disease processes. You have to understand the differences and the similarities between the two, and then be able to use that information to evaluate and determine which would be the better course of action. So you can see when we get up to level 5, we're really looking at, some higher level processes that really require you to not only understand a lot of the information, but understand how it fits into a bigger picture and be able to make some kind of judgments. Now, the last step is really creating, right? That's where we're pushing the boundaries of what we know. This is where we can, understand things at a level where we can develop new processes, new knowledge, new theories, right? So think of, developing a new process for completing something. We really need to be able to understand all the different intricacies of what we're trying to achieve in order for us to figure out how to come up with a new process that's going to be better than what already exists. So again, this is pushing the boundaries. This is the highest level of learning. This is something like if we do research or something like that, we're always in this creating space where we're trying to, say this is what we know and this is where we're trying to go so we can understand better, or we can develop something new that's going to solve a certain problem for us and stuff like that. So as you can see, this is certainly a hierarchy where we go up from, the remembering is just kind of parroting back information, facts, figures, those kinds of things, all the way up to where we're at a point where we can actually create new pieces of information and new theories and processes. So not surprisingly, level 1 and level 2 are really considered lower levels of learning. And again, this kind of surprises students sometimes, especially when they transition sometimes from undergraduate to graduate school, even from high school to college sometimes, especially if they're, in a health professions courses where they're going to push them beyond what they've probably experienced at the undergraduate level or at high school or something like that. Because a lot of students think that if I understand it and can explain it, that's the finish line, right? And as we've seen going through these levels, there's certainly much higher levels of knowledge mastery that can be achieved, right? So we think of levels 3 through 6 as involving much greater levels of cognitive processing, right? This is where, we really have to, think about how things are connected. We really need to understand the bigger picture of the concepts and stuff like that. And I'm sure as a healthcare provider or someone training to be a healthcare provider, I'm sure you can already see why it would be important to move beyond these low levels, levels 1 and level 2 of Bloom's taxonomy. We really need to develop what we'll call these critical thinking skills. Things like being able to break things down, being able to evaluate, being able to come up with new ideas in different situations. That's probably going to be where we need to get as a healthcare provider. We certainly need to get beyond remembering and just, again, being able to explain concepts. So why should you know about Bloom's, right? I kind of made this point in the first slide that, instructors or educators usually have a really good understanding of Bloom's taxonomy because they use it a lot in their designing their courses and writing exam questions and creating learning outcomes and stuff like that. Students sometimes aren't familiar with it, right? For a lot of you watching this video, you may have never heard of Bloom's taxonomy, or even if you've heard of it, your instructor has mentioned it, maybe you didn't really understand what it was, right? So why is it important for you as a student to understand it? Well, one, I think it helps you understand what's expected of you as a student, right? Are you taking a course where the goal is to get you to a point of understanding, right? Where as long as you can explain concepts and you can, pick up on them in a simple exam question that asks you about a basic definition or, an example or something like that, and pick what concept it is, you'll probably be okay. But if you're taking a course and the instructor is going to expect you to be able to take information and apply it, so maybe they ask questions that are more patient scenario questions, and they're saying, how would you apply this concept or something like that? Or they're going to ask you to make judgments. Maybe they'll ask you to say, here's 2 concepts or 2 approaches we discussed in class, which one would be better in this certain scenario? You're going to have to push yourself to a higher level of Bloom. So it's, again, and a higher level of knowledge mastery, right? So again, it's good to know. I always think of it as like knowing the rules of the game before you start playing, right? You need to say, hey, what are the expectations? What did my instructor expect in this course? The other thing is it allows you to continuously push yourself to higher levels, right? So once you feel like, okay, I've memorized some of the key facts and figures and definitions, I've moved up where now I can explain it in my own words. What's the next step, right? Well, the next step might be to say, okay, I know this information, I can explain it, but how could it be applicable? How could I apply this, right? So it's like once you get to a level, you can start to say, here's where I'm at. And understanding Bloom's gives you that idea that there's certainly ever increasing higher levels of mastery, right? And the other thing is it helps you speak a common language with your instructor sometimes. A lot of times I'll hear instructors say, you know, you really need to develop critical thinking skills in order to be a healthcare provider. And I always look at that and I'm like, I don't know if students always know what they mean by that, right? Well, what they're saying is you need to get up to those higher levels of Bloom's. You need to be able to apply, evaluate, analyze, create in some cases. But, you know, I think students sometimes don't always hear that and really understand what that means in the context of a course. So how do you understand the expectations? The first bullet point I talked about was really understand what your instructor expects is the first step in that is understanding a little bit about Bloom's taxonomy. Well, the learning outcomes, which if you go to the syllabus, your course syllabus, that's usually where they'll have a list of the different learning outcomes for the course, or sometimes instructors for even individual modules or individual lectures or something, they'll have a list of objectives. And you can look at the objectives to give yourself some clues over what their expectations are. Right? So it's another reason to review the syllabus or do some prep before you actually go to class, right? And so in the table at the bottom, there's some different verbs that you commonly see associated with different levels of knowledge mastery that are, you know, part of that Bloom's taxonomy. So if you see verbs when you're looking at the course syllabus and you're reviewing the learning objectives that ask you to be able to maybe define or label or list or name or recognize or recall, you know, you know that this course is meant to be lower level, right? You're not expected to achieve a high level of mastery. It's just kind of getting you exposed to some really basic concepts, right? And this is a lot of times what you see in maybe introductory classes, right? You know, where maybe it's at the level of remembering and understanding where you'll see, you know, things like explain, describe, summarize, classify, discuss, and translate even, you know, that's still a lower level, but maybe they'll say, this is the first course. We're going to get you up to understand the concepts. And maybe there's a next course, or maybe in your next year, then we move up the levels. And now we're going to, you know, revisit this and start to say, now you need to be able to apply it or evaluate or even create in sometimes or analyze. So again, it's just a clue to give you like, what does my instructor expect from me, right? And again, this is usually buried in your syllabus in some way, right? So just some final thoughts. Again, I wanted this to be a quick video, but I do think it's helpful. This isn't a study strategy or anything like that, but I do think it's helpful to at least understand some of the, you know, the basic concepts related to Bloom's. So this is a very general overview. There's much more that you could learn about Bloom's taxonomy, and you know, you could certainly there's a lot of great readings and stuff like that that are a lot of times geared for educators. But at the same point, I think as a student, you could probably, you know, glean some helpful information from those readings and stuff like that. But I think this is a good starting point for starting to think about how you can align your studying approaches with your target learning objectives, right? And that's what we're going to talk about in some of the subsequent videos. Because if your instructor is really maybe just expecting you to reach a level of maybe understanding, you may study differently than if the instructor expects you to be able to apply information or analyze information or evaluate different theories or concepts or something like that, or even create, right? Your approach in a course, again, will probably align with what the expectations are. And that's where I think having at least some understanding of Bloom's taxonomy can be helpful.
If you enjoyed this content, be sure to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel, Learning That Lasts, and check out my book, Learning That Lasts, which is available on Amazon.